Hi, Carlton King, former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in a jihadi organisation.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe for free.
My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy Podcast, the show that shines a light on the world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations, but also, indeed, generally more than ever, what we look at now is the world of geopolitics. That's actually the world which functions for us all. You and I, whether we've ever been in the secret world or anywhere else, you will find that the result of geopolitics, the thing that goes around us, is what actually functions. So this is why what I do when I talk now these days, I don't only keep it on the world of secret intelligence, national security and armed governmental personal protection operations. I actually spread it out. And often I do that with my, should I call her my partner in crime? I think that's what I've been saying. A person who aids and assists me in understanding another element of the world of geopolitics, and that is probably where you get your understanding of geopolitics from. That's namely from journalism in all its formats. However, now and then what I do is I carry out what I call critical thinking programs, which I undertake by myself. And this is one of those such programs, a critical thinking program. And what I'm actually going to do on this particular podcast is I'm going to deal with this issue myself, and then at some stage, probably in about 2 or 3 weeks' time, I'm going to ask my sidekick, my partner in crime, the lovely Fergus Itzhak, to actually comment on this issue herself, just to give you her understanding of it. And you'll understand why I'm going to do that when I speak about what the issue is. Actually, I'm going to speak about what I believe is one of the most critical aspects of how we presently live today. It's what I'm calling the gender battle. Now, this battle, which is particularly prominent in the Western world, but it's also in other parts of the world where the West has orientated itself and is fully entrenched in the ways and thinkings of the individuals that are not perceived as Westerners, let's argue. Gender is also becoming an issue to a lesser or greater degree. Now, why is it a problem? First and foremost, I haven't said it's a problem, but I've said it's a critical issue. And the critical issue is that I believe we are taking the gender conflict to a level whereby it will become a conflict, or is already a conflict within the West, rather than if you will, an issue that should be dealt with from the perspective of giving everybody their human rights. In other words, giving everybody opportunity and being non-discriminatory. It's now becoming an issue where it's always perceived as a conflict between men, particularly white men, and women. And this is where it then becomes problematic, because it can be perceived as something that's ganging up on white men. Now, it may well be that it's perceived to be ganging up on white upper-class men who always were perceived as ruling the roost, albeit that's not necessarily true, but that's the perception. But actually it's spreading out on all men, and in particular, I think people feeling the brunt of this may often be working-class men, albeit that that's not said. And I don't know if that's very, very positive in our society. So let me just go back. Let me look at the issue of gender as a male. Let me look at it and see where I'm coming from and how I perceive the situation. I should say I'm coming from it from a perspective of being a black male. That's not black male as in being blackmailed, but a male who happens to be black. Okay, so what is what I think this problem that's now perceived? So let me look at something as simple as the suffragette movement. Now, the way suffragette movement seems to be being taught in schools is that this was a movement of enlightenment, and it was put in place to raise up all women and to give women the same opportunities as men, and that women were held back. They were, oftentimes you hear it, not in the workplace, not given opportunity, tied to the apron with children, never getting out, never doing jobs, never working forward. Now, in itself, this is where we begin, I believe, to hit the first aspect of this that's problematic. And that is the fact that we're perceiving all women as the same. Now, I said before I was a black man. So if I look at the role of black women in the West, and this is a Western orientation in general right now, how it's perceived, I would say that black women in the West, for most of the 20th century, as they were for about 3 or 4 centuries before that, because, you know, blacks were not always enslaved or were not always pushed down, but for 3 or 4 centuries before that, after the slavery movement took on a colour coding, because what you have to understand that slavery's gone on forever and a day, but it was not until the coming of the African slave trade, or what's known as a transatlantic slave trade, was not really necessarily colour-coded. It didn't relate just to black people. In fact, the word slave came from the word Slav. They were white slaves were perceived as that. So this is quite a late movement as far as history is concerned, and it negates the fact that blacks had a great history in ancient Egypt and in very many other places. And we can talk about that another time, but I don't want to go into that too much here and now because it's not relevant to this process. So when we look at it and we talk about women, were then white women somehow in unison or in unity with their black sisters? And to be fair, for the vast majority of time, up until the mid, even to late 20th century, that was not the case. In the West, we're talking about the Western world now. So it was not the case. So frankly, slave owners, males or females, generally treated their enslaved people, enslaved women, in exactly the same manner. No different. Indeed, there are cases, and you can read it from various places, from the United States, from the Caribbean, from Central and South America, where women were treating the enslaved women worse than the men were. Now, that may have something to do with the fact that for some of the men, they were, raping the women, or if not raping the black women, taking them as concubines. And some, let's be realistic, were taking them as wives, etc., etc. Now, where they were not being taken as wives, they were often being with the black women they wanted to be and leaving the wife behind. This is particularly the case in the more stronger slave areas, so in South America, in North America, the United States in particular, in the Caribbean, where they didn't stand to them. And this is particularly English speaking. So oftentimes in other forms of slavery, one didn't have that aspect whereby you did not stand to the children which you had. So you can see it in France, example. You'll see people becoming counts because they, who were of colour, because they inherited what the father had, who happened to be white. So it's a different way of dealing with slavery. But we're not just talking about slavery. It's not transgressing either. I just want to say that there wasn't a union. So even past the slave trade, so let's say past the let's say the 1880s, when slavery was banned in Brazil, one of the latter countries for banning of slavery, what you would see is that there wasn't necessarily a union between women of all different colours. It wasn't there. Now, I'm going to go even tighter now into this. There wasn't even a union between women of the same colour, particularly those perceived as white, between the working class and the ruling elite. So this is why I talk about the particular aspects that we need to hone in on more and understand more and be educated to more. And some people call this a revisionism, but it isn't revisionism. This is just straightforward history. So example, if you look in the United Kingdom and the Pankhurst movement, what Emmeline Pankhurst and the suffragettes were looking for, and indeed fighting for, was not parity for working class women and ruling elite women. No, when they asked for the right to vote, example, they were asking for the right to vote on the same level as men. Now, this is what people misunderstand. So in Britain, what that meant was that in the First World War, as an example, it has been estimated that around about 60 to 70% of men who had to fight, and die. They were conscripted to fight. Obviously, women were not conscripted to fight, but men were. You got a letter and it said, you are now in the army, or whatever, you're conscripted, turn up at this time, date, time and place, after 1915. And you're in the army now, no rights to say not, other than being a conscientious objector. And indeed, many people who may have wanted to be conscientious objectors were put off by women walking around giving them a white feather, suggesting that they were weaklings and that they were cowards, etc., etc. And even casting aspersions on individuals, suggesting that they were less of a man and therefore homosexual or whatever. So women were not progressive by treating everybody the same, by saying, well, there's no difference to a homosexual man and a heterosexual man. No, they were casting aspersions of the era on men who didn't want to fight. So this is something that men had to deal with as young as 17, to be fair, 17, 18. Who were, conscripted into the 18 is the actual age, but many signed up at 17. So this was the fact that these guys went to fight a war, didn't start the war, had no rights to say we don't want to be in it. Now, initially, when you could be a conscientious objector, you had to show that you were one, and indeed could be imprisoned for that. So. Of course, women didn't have to fight. So that's an advantage, you could argue, for the women. They don't have to fight, but men do and have to spend X amount of years, potentially, if you were unlucky, X amount of years, or in fact the normal guy, in trench warfare. Now, and these guys had no right to vote, because the people who had a right to vote were property-owning classes, or classes that paid for properties at a certain length, a certain level of owning or of earning, where you could then have a right to vote. And what the suffragette movement was asking for was for women to have the same rights as men within that property-owning class, etc., or those of a certain level of education or a level of wealth, that they would be able to have the same rights as men who had a right to vote. Now, universal suffrage for men only came about after the First World War, when the ruling elite in Britain feared insurrection, as had happened by the Bolsheviks in Russia, and therefore said we're going to have to give the guys something, so we give them the right to vote. So basically, this is after the First World War, men got the right to vote. By this time, women also got a right to vote in a limited level, and then in 1921 got the same universal suffrage as men did. So what I'm saying is, Pankhurst was never asking for all women to have a right to vote. Right, now, if you mirror the suffragette movement in Britain, it was also happening in the United States. And in the United States, they were very, very clear. Black women who wanted to be part of the movement, and I'm talking wealthy black women now, who wanted universal suffrage. Now, this was a little bit different because men were having suffrage generalised to them in the United States, not so in Britain, but in the United States. But what they didn't want, and there was a massive big march, actually. It's a well-known march. And they said to the black women who turned up to actually take part in this march, please don't come on it. We don't want you on the march. And then there was a compromise made for the very wealthy women, because there's some wealthy blacks. You can have it at the back of the march, right at the back of the march you can be. But for those women down south, those women who were basically not enslaved because there was nothing set aside for them. So there was no unity amongst women in terms of feminism working for every woman. Now, what people will have you believe is that that was the case, that there was a generalised perspective for women. It's also important when we look at this in terms of working, because women did work. For the vast majority of women's lives as we understand the process in the capitalist system, let's say from industrialisation in Britain, example, let's just take Britain as an example, you could say in the Americas, you could say everywhere, women worked. Indeed, I'm trying to think in a society in which women didn't work, who were of the working body of women. They were not kept in, unable to work. So what you'll hear from a lot of women who talk about in the suffragette movement, particularly when it comes from between the First and Second World Wars, they say, oh, we were kept away from working. You know, we'd worked in the First World War to aid the war effort, yeah, but then we were stopped and prevented from working, prevented from being in work. That is not true. Not true at all. That is true for the ruling elite of women. And this is the problem with the movement. The movement has been that of the ruling women. In fact, I would go as far as to say that the feminist movement has only looked at one type of woman. White, middle class, upper class women. It has not looked at the working class woman, right? Because these were working. You know, women were happy to get out of working in the mines with their children, in the factories with their children. They were happy to try and get away from that devastating work that had to be done, where they were losing their lives. You know, the life expectancy of a Manchester mill worker in the 1820s, 1830s was like 22, 23 years of age. You know, they were having a great time, men working in those factories, and the women were working besides them. Women were working in the factories on the machinery. Women were working in the mines, you know, pulling stuff as were the crates, maybe not hewing out the actual coal, but pulling the coal trains along. So women had always worked, and then when they came into the factories, before that, they were working on spinning before the spinning jenny, before the mass orientation of spinning works in the industrialised sense. They were working at home, carrying out these actions, spinning and making clothing, etc., etc., etc. Yep. So this idea that women weren't working and were prevented from is not true. They were necessarily working to keep the working class functioning, to keep, or let's take it away from the Marxist orientation of working class, let's say from the working women, they were working as maids, working as wet nurses, working as, you know, for black women, whatever. And you can see that reflected in the United States or in the Americas in general, Central and Southern America and South America. You know, the people were working. It's a misnomer when you suggest that women weren't out to work. it's a certain level of work that women weren't getting. And that's where the argument is for a higher level echelon woman to try and get that higher level of work. And also what I would say is there are tasks sometimes in other parts of the world where you think it wouldn't be the case, like in the Islamic world, where women were doctors forever and a day. Example. Yeah, when they weren't in the West. So, we shouldn't perceive that the West has somehow always been progressive and other parts of the world in terms of gender and other parts of the world were not. It's just how that gender was orientated. And we shouldn't always think that men had a great opportunity in carrying out this work or doing things in terms of work. Indeed, often it wasn't an opportunity at all. It was indeed a curse. If you didn't want to fight in the First World War, your chances were slim. That's you signed up, and you could be imprisoned for not doing so. So there isn't an advantage there. There may well be an advantage of being a ruling class man, a man at the top of the game, but there is that same advantage of being a ruling class woman as opposed to working class men. You see, this is what you have to understand. Yeah, when you're looking at the ruling elite, man or woman, this was something that was advantageous. I'll tell you one of the other factors, which is often forgotten. Actually, in the battle for black equal rights, women were often negative to that. If you think of the Bostonian women, Irish heritaged women who had a bad time within the potato famine, whose families had gone over to the Americas, and then post all of that period of time, post the 70 years since the potato famine moving forward, had emigrated to the United States for a better life. Yeah, these were exactly the women who, when the men were actually not happy, but not unwilling to allow black children into schools, it was the women who went out absolutely regressively to prevent black children going to their schools and prevent them coming to live in their particular area and prevent them doing X, Y, and Z. So what I'm saying is there isn't a unity of women. It's not that we're all working together. It is very much orientated towards who you are and to what your, if you want a better word, I don't want to use the old-fashioned Marxist terminologies, but I tend to find myself moving towards that, just because it's slanted in today's terms. But if I use it, people will understand the working woman and the working man had very little in common, actually, with the middle and upper woman and the middle and upper man. But the middle and upper woman had more in common, a lot in common with the middle and upper man than she did with the working woman. Indeed, she'd held the working woman down. And if you look at it from the basis of colorism, it was absolutely the case that women of the higher echelon had a much closer unison with men than they did with women. Women of the lower levels of colorism. So this is one of the issues. So that's the historical aspect. I don't want to go too deeply into it, but please look that up. And as I always say, and I'd like you to understand, please do challenge me. That's why Fergus and I are very, very keen to actually get out and to bring our show to you live. So you can ask us the questions. You can maybe make questions about, what is it like spying or whatever, and ask her questions about what is it like in the media? What do they say they want to push forward, and what do they say we want to keep back? You're only going to hear these things from us if we go live, because you'll be there and you can ask us the questions as we're speaking. So that's something that we're keen to do. So please, write to us as well. You can, and we'll try and answer these questions. Right. So moving forward. So you've now got the situation where women are coming together more as a collective. That's probably the 60s, 70s in the United States, and pressing then into Western Europe as well, coming together as a collective, and in many other places around the world. You should also not forget, and this is actually quite interesting, that particularly in the Western East, so by that I mean in the communist areas, communist controllers, women were much more part of the system. Not necessarily part of the political system, but part of the scene in which there were progressions, going to universities, etc., etc. Indeed, the reason that I'll give you a fine example of that. If you went to Kabul, yes, Afghanistan, Kabul, in the 1970s, when it was communist or socialist, i.e. not yet communist, but socialist sometimes, but definitely under the communist regime, you'd have people, women, wearing miniskirts and going to university. Okay? Obviously middle class women, going to university and wearing miniskirts. And they were pushing forward under the auspices of communism or communist-orientated thinking, that women should have the rights to determine what they wish and want to do. Who stopped that? I'll tell you who stopped that. The West. I'll say it again. The West stopped that. When the Soviets came to the aid of President Najibullah when requested to keep the movement towards socialism in place, when that was done, and you'll know it as the 1980s, when they call it the invasion of communist Russia, actually that was an assistance request and they moved in. When that happened, okay, we, the Western powers, read for that, in particular the United States, came up with a way of combating the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And that was to support the Mujahideen. And the Mujahideen would be perceived as regressive in thought, i.e. women should not be in universities, definitely not in miniskirts, definitely not showing their hair. You can see the pictures. I'm not telling you any rubbish. As I always say to you, look it up. Look up 1970s Afghanistan, look up Kabul University, and you will see women showing their hair, miniskirts, tank tops, like they were in the West. Okay? What body was put together to stop that? It was the Western power, the United States in particular, aided by Great Britain, etc., to prevent the Soviet Union from taking that area and controlling it fully, and also by creating a body of people, assisting that body of people, the Mujahideen, to fight off the Soviets, knowing that part of that would be that they would put women backwards 1,000 years and have them only in the home, only subservient to men, only able to show their eyes and not their legs, and definitely not their legs, definitely not have miniskirts on, definitely not have tank tops nearly showing their breast, etc., 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 wearing loose-fitting garments, and not being educated. That was accepted. If the battle was won to defeat the Soviets, that would be what we would call in the national security industry collateral. Because the ruling elite of the West, that is the politicians and the people who have influence over the politicians, read for that business, have pushed the politicians into a position that said, we want to stop communism wherever it is around the world, and we now want to stop the Soviets, they always say Russians, but the Soviet Union really, from controlling this area, and work out how you can do that. So a clever CIA officer working out of Pakistan thought, what can we tell them? We can tell them that the Soviets are people who believe in no God and who are abusing your women by letting them run around the streets and do who knows what. So let's combat that, and we'll support them then with arms and with training, etc., 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 in order to get the Soviets defeated and to bleed them out. Then when we jump later on, and I'm now involved in Afghanistan, etc., and we're then talking about, for the first time we're going to give Afghan women the opportunity to go to school. Nonsense. Total and utter nonsense. This is propaganda. Nonsense. Afghan women were going to school 20, 30 years before that until we helped suppress it. See, and this is the situation. So again, when you look at the women's movement, you've got to look at the West not only always being a positive factor, but oftentimes being a negative factor in that movement, if it suits. But where are we now? Because I'm conscious about bringing it to the roundabout where we sit now and not just being historical. So where we sit now is a full-on battle between men and women, and the blame being placed on men for everything. So let's look at it in a couple of lines. So let's take the line of what I call the criminal line, the dangerous line of men. It is a case, I believe, that men are a dangerous aspect in the species. Now, it may well be that they're dangerous because it's genetic, or they may well be dangerous because it's a learnt behaviour. I can't say 100%. I'll say some of it's a learnt behaviour, some of it is genetic. But it is clear that men are dangerous and can be dangerous and are orientated, as I say, as a learnt behaviour to be dangerous. So, that being the case, is it true that in Britain as we sit today, that women and girls cannot walk the streets? Is it true that they are at danger way above that of men? And the reality is that it's not true. I'll say it again. It's not true. Okay? For every woman who gets murdered, now the stats move around a bit because it depends on where the murders are and what they are and what has happened. But generally, for every woman being murdered, there are about 6 men being murdered. Now, if you're going to say who are the perpetrators of these murders, yes, 9 times out of 10, maybe not 9 times out of 10, maybe less, maybe 8, it's men. There is no doubt about that. But that does not mean that the victims, who happen to be men, who are being murdered at a rate much higher than women are being murdered, should not be seen and perceived as being at threat and at danger. So why should we then just say women and girls can't walk the streets and take great actions and not say the same about men? I mean, that clearly is wrong. And so what it does is it makes a divide that people won't speak out about. Now, in fact, some people may listen to this podcast and may think, don't like this fella speaking out about this. Let's not allow him to speak anymore. Let's not platform him. I've been very clear in saying right from the beginning of this that this is the debate I want to have. I want people to have a debate. I'm not saying that men are not harming women because, as I said, with that stat, I'm a criminologist. So with that stat, I can tell you exactly, with that statistic, I can tell you exactly that men are the cause of the problem. What I'm saying is that men aren't aiming that problem solely at women. So let's look at an area where women are the main victims thereof, and that is obviously in the home. I would say that the main victims of what you would call a home dispute are generally women. I think I can say that. Now, the reason why I'm slightly hesitant is because up until now, up until about definitely 20 years ago, very few men would walk into a police station and say, my wife, my girlfriend, whatever, is beating me up. Why would that be the case? Because the police would say, come on, mate, surely you can defend yourself. That's the reality of it. They'd say, come on, mate, surely you can defend yourself. Right. Now, put that into the other perspective, and if a woman came in, the police would not have said, oh, surely you can defend yourself. Oftentimes, the police would have perceived that as negative on the man actually harming a woman. Now, where was the disconnect, though? There was a disconnect. And the disconnect was oftentimes from older officers. They'd say something like, and I'll give you a concrete example, because every officer who joined the police in the United Kingdom has to do 2 years as a uniformed officer on the streets, is a general rule. Although some do find a way to get away and hide away in places where they don't have to do their time on the streets. You know, that's wrong. But you have to do generally 2 years. And then you can specialise. And I'm not going to pretend that after my 2 years, I entered the police in order to be in the special branch because I was interested in political offences and political crime and the politics of the world and geopolitics, which is why I am. So I'm not going to say anything against that process. And I'm not going to say that I spent many a time on the street. But what I am going to say to you is I was there and I can recall very, very clearly amongst some of what in the police terminology you would call old sweats, guys who've been in for a long time, jaded guys, if you want to use that terminology. Sorry, let's be frank and straight. Jaded guys and gals. Okay? So police officers, men or women. You'd hear them often say, oh, it's a dispute, don't get too involved. I never liked that. I hated that, to be fair. I thought that was a negative aspect when people suggested that this was somehow a dispute between man and wife and difficult to get involved. So, as I said, I'll give you a concrete example of it. I was walking down the street with a tutor officer because I'd just come out of the training school. Yes, I've been a detective for the Americans before, but you still have to go through the British system and be uniform, and you're going to have to be tutored by an officer. I'm walking down with this officer. And I saw from the corner of my eyes when we walked past the corner, I saw what looked like a fight or hitting or something like that. And I said, oh, there's something happening around here. And I saw it then that a chap was literally dragging a woman. And I said, nah, we got to get in there and stop that. And this guy says, well, be careful, that might be, it might be a dispute. I said, what do you mean it's a dispute? I said, this is obviously an assault. So I go in, speak to the guy, split them up, say, right, what's happening here? And he's dragged this woman, this guy, slapped her obviously, but I didn't see, so I can't say something I didn't see, but he clearly had done. And he had pulled her hair out, so I could see a patch missing. I said, right, you're under arrest, my friend. She said, that's my husband. I said, yeah, I don't care who he is. He's under arrest. He's obviously pulled out your hair. We can deal with this issue. And then I said, right, come on. So I went to put handcuffs on him. And it wasn't fight back. And let me tell you something also, just by the by. If somebody doesn't want you to put handcuffs on them, it's extremely difficult to do so, especially if they've got any size or weight or strength. And I'm a fellow who's done kung fu all my life. But I'll tell you now, if you really want to resist and not got cuffs on it, it takes more than one man, 9 times out of 10, or one woman to do it. You have to have some strength if the guy doesn't, or the woman doesn't want you to put cuffs on him. And so oftentimes it might look as though it's overplayed, but it isn't. It's quite difficult. So anyway, this guy, he is not fighting. He allows me to put the handcuffs on him. And I say I'm putting the handcuffs on him for the pure and simple reason that I've seen you now dragging this lady, pulling her hair. You say it's your wife. I'm not sure you won't do something for me. So I want to hold you here until the van turns up. So I'm placing cuffs on you. I'm polite and whatever. So she then starts trying to hit me, saying, no, leave my husband alone, don't arrest him, he's not done anything, blah, 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 blah. And this officer, the one who's tutor officer, who looks at me to suggest, he didn't say anything, to suggest, see what you've done? You've now caused this, and you're now who's the bad guy. So anyway, I said, just wait here. She waits there, I calm her down. Everybody's calm. Van turns up, put him in the van. And I say, will you come into the police car, not the van, and come to the station, because I want to take photographs of what's happened to your hair, etc., so I can show, when we go to court. I said, we don't need to do this in front of your husband. This can be done quietly, blah, blah, blah. Because I was figuring that her fear was that, if she goes home and gets a beating, she doesn't want this to happen. And I can see that might be the case. Because there's always extraneous aspects happening, so you can never tell. So we get into the station, I take the photographs, get them done. I say, listen, he's going to go to court, and we're going to have to go to go to court. We can put the evidence in front of a magistrate so he can be held, and then subsequently there'll be another case. Is he going to come back to the house? Might well be the case. I can't say he's not, but we'll hold him overnight. But he's going to go into the case, and I need that evidence to show that it can go forward, etc., etc., etc. And I would love for you to come into court to speak up, because if you don't, what's going to happen is it's going to be thrown out in the end, because we'll have no evidence. Because I haven't seen him hitting you, but I have seen that you've got hair pulled, and I can see that, and he looked as though he was the one that was doing it. And I'm not going to lie, I'm going to say things as they are, because that's just the way I play my game. I'm a straightforward guy. I'm going to say exactly what I saw and what happened when I came round. And the corner again, after I saw from the corner of my eye. So anyway, we do that. Photographs are taken. She's frightened, obviously. And to cut a long story short, she refuses to go to court, and the guy basically walks away, you can argue, because we've got no evidence and the magistrate throws the case out, etc., etc. Right. So I understand why cases have now been made that you can remove a person from the household so he doesn't come back. I understand that. He doesn't come back. So that is an advantageous movement of moving the cause out to give the person time to say, this is what's happened to me, pluck up the courage to go in front of a court, because you do need evidence. You can't just surmise something's happened and then say that's what's gone on. No, you always need, and this is sometimes where I think the movement goes wrong. I think what the suggestion often is that people turn around and say, this has happened, and therefore this should go to a court in this way. And that's not the way it works. If you have evidence, you have to provide the evidence. If you don't provide the evidence, you have no recourse to the crime being individual being found guilty, and the crime being registered as such, and the individual then being sentenced to whatever that might be, whatever the judge decides. And of course, you also need to prove to a jury that something's happened. And in our system, we have the system whereby a person is innocent until proven guilty. And the proof of guilty in a criminal court, and people shouldn't misunderstand this, is beyond all reasonable doubt. Okay? It's not on the balance of probabilities like you have on a civil case. That's just, it's probable that this has happened. No. In a criminal court, it's beyond all reasonable doubt. Now, understand those words, beyond it, right? That then means that it isn't sufficient to say, oh, well, that might, or it's highly likely that is the case. No, that's not beyond all reasonable doubt. It's beyond it. It's way past the reasonable doubt. It's beyond reasonable doubt. That's what you have to prove. And so we come back to another factor now. And this is the factor of how now we have changed in the United Kingdom how the system works, of actually getting somebody into a court in the first instance. Because now the charges are laid on the say-so of the CPS, which, for people who don't understand, it's the Crown Prosecution Service. Now, these are the lawyers who, on behalf of the Crown, who basically is the ruling body in the United Kingdom, the crown, so the king, on behalf of the king, on behalf of the crown, these prosecutors prosecute in the name of the king. Okay? Previously queen, now king. They prosecute in their name. And they decide, these prosecutors, whether there is a case to answer in the first place. So the police, all they are doing is investigating, arresting an individual, investigating to see whether that case is in any way, in their minds, the police's mind, can be proven and that they've got the right person. Then it's up to the prosecutor to say whether there is enough for a charge. And if there's enough for a charge to be put in, that means that they're happy to put it in front of a court for it to go through the court processes. Now, they used to work off a 60-40. So in other words, if there isn't a chance of 60% as opposed to a 40% chance of loss, 60% chance of winning, they will not take the case to court, and therefore police cannot charge. Understand that, I'll say it again. Police cannot charge. The police cannot charge without the CPS saying this case will be successful to a 60% chance. They will not charge them otherwise. Right? And that's the generalisation of what that charge is. So therefore, when you hear stats about, example, individuals who say that they have been raped, as opposed to individuals who actually go in front of a court, and then again, as opposed to individuals actually found guilty, that's all to do with this process. The police are the smallest part of that process. The police, 9 times out of 10, my understanding, will go to the 8th degree to arrest the individual, etc., etc., etc. But that's just the small part of it. They then have to get a charge via the CPS for them to say, yes, you can charge them. And then when that's done, the police have to gather the evidence that when it gets in front of a court, the jury will say, if it's a jury trial, will say, yes, there's enough evidence there that we will find this individual guilty. If not, the individual can't be found guilty. And people seem to misunderstand that. Now, I would argue that we've gone so much down the line now that what should happen is it should be like in in Europe, Western Europe, where they have a different system. We have an adversarial system, they have an inquisitorial system. And that inquisitorial system basically has a magistrate, which is like the CPS, making the decisions for the police. All of them. Leading the investigation for the police. So the police lead the investigation in Britain, but they can't make the decision as to how to charge. In Europe, a magistrate leads the investigation. A magistrate actually says to the police, this is what you need to do, from the beginning of the case. This is what you need to do, this is the evidence I need, otherwise we're not even going to arrest this guy. So you see, that's the difference. So what you've got in Britain is, you've got a body that turns around and says, no, we're not charging, but will never be questioned as to why the charge isn't. Because everybody will assume it's the police who do this charging. Well, the police do. Because you have a police officer, they're called a custody officer, and he takes or she takes the charge. But they can only take the charge if the CPS says, yes, you can charge. Whereas in Europe, that investigating magistrate, everybody knows that the investigating magistrate is the one who turns around and says, well, no, we're not charging. So then the negativity of not charging hits the investigating magistrate. In Britain, it doesn't hit the CPS. It hits the police. And I always explain this in terms of the Stephen Lawrence case, because now, within 10 days, the police had 5 individuals whom they thought had committed the murder against Stephen Lawrence. And they put those 5 people forward and had arrested them, in fact. Had them in a cell, arrested them. And then the CPS said, the Crown Prosecution Service, there is not enough evidence to go forward. But everybody blames the police then for the next 10 years of not having the individual with the evidence. No, the CPS said there wasn't enough evidence. The police had their evidence. They said, this is the evidence we've got. And based on this evidence, we have arrested these individuals and we believe they have committed the crime. That's what we believe. And we're happy to put them in front of a court. No, said the CPS. It's not going to. And once the CPS say no, that is it. There's nowhere to go. You cannot take it. It was actually an extremely abnormal aspect that the police actually said, we will take, in Stephen Lawrence's case, we will take what was effectively a civil case against these guys, but in a criminal way, by the police actually saying, we will go against the CPS and charge them several years later. And this is John Grieve who did that. I mean, I don't think it's ever been done since. But he did that. Now, he was a policeman, not a CPS person, because they're still saying there's no evidence. Now, people don't understand that and say, oh, the police this, the police that, police corruption. It's rubbish. They don't understand the system. And this is the problem with the United Kingdom. People don't understand the system. And this is from the beginning of this talk what I've been trying to explain. That if you don't understand the background, you don't understand the history, you don't understand the system, then what you get is a skewed understanding of how things function and of what has actually been going on. It skews your perception of things. So let me give you another example. Every man knows that it is extremely dangerous to walk into a pub. And every man walks into a pub, as particularly if he's about, there's some people go in pubs when they're 16, 17, 18. They shouldn't be 16, 17, they shouldn't be, but they do. Particularly when they're 16, 17. They know when they go in a pub, it's a dangerous place to go into. Because in there are a lot of drunk guys, potentially, and those drunk guys are violent. And they know if you look at a guy the wrong way, some guy will turn around and say, who are you looking at, mate? And before you know it, there's a fight ensued, and before you know it, you could lose your life. So when they go in there, they go in with a perspective of behaviour that they've learnt behaviour through their life, that there is a negative to actually looking incorrectly or taking on an angry man. There's a negative to it. It may well lead you to having your teeth knocked out or worse. So, generally, they don't do it. Now, when they get drunk, they do it, and then they have a fight with somebody else, and sometimes it ends up with people dying. Women have not been orientated to that culture. Indeed, women have been orientated to a different culture where, for many a man, you never hit a woman no matter what. So you could say what you wanted to a man and never get punched. But if that woman was with another man, what would generally happen is that man would get punched for what that woman said, because he'll defend the woman. Right? So this is how these things are nuanced, but people don't see the nuance of them. People do not see the nuance. The rise, example now, in the arrests of women by police is because there are now more police women. Previously, with lesser police women, very few policemen would arrest women because when they got into the front of the sergeant, so what have you been arrested for? Or talking loud. And couldn't you deal with it? Right? That's the problem you had. Now, women arrest women, and the custody officer may well be a woman, and it's woman on woman. So it's not a problem. So you see how things function. They're not straightforward. And I see this a lot when people say, good example it would be, a lot of black people are stop and searched. Right, okay. Now, stop and search is a tool. It's an effective tool that can be used, and it's a tool that can be used by people who are racist. So, but which is it? Which is it? If it takes a knife off the street of a guy who's going to go and perform a murder on somebody else or stab somebody else up, which is the right thing to do? These are decisions. These are decisions that are actually very, very difficult to make. And if you just look at it from one perspective and you don't look at it in the round, you're then just going to say, oh, well, it's this, this and this, without evidencing any of the things that go on. So what I'm saying is that each case should be taken on its merits. And I think that is where I will hold for today in terms of this critical thinking. And I'm hoping that what will happen is, as I said, in a couple of weeks' time, that we're going to have a different view of what I've just said. But that view will be coming from Fergus. And you'll see how those perspectives either are the same or are different. I don't know. We'll see. It'll be interesting to see how that is, how that works and what is perceived. Because after all, this is what we try and do. We try and look at the geopolitics from all sides, from all perspectives, from all understandings. And more importantly, what I believe we should be doing is actually looking at it from a deeper understanding. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. And I hope you found this interesting. And if you did, then hopefully you'll listen again next week.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for free.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
More than a quarter of a century, I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.